The moment the truth was believed, everything got worse. The Rothmere house ran on schedules and quiet efficiency. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Hannah didn't speak. Doctors called it selective mutism. Her father accepted that answer because it required nothing from him. Janet Williams worked in that house long enough to learn where fear hid, not in voices, but in timing and footsteps in rooms that felt wrong. When Hannah finally spoke, it wasn't to accuse anyone. It was to ask a question no one in the house was prepared to answer. And from that moment on, believing the truth didn't bring safety. It brought consequences. Because what happened after Hannah was believed was far more dangerous than what happened before. Stories like this don't survive on algorithms. They survive on people who care. If this story means something to you, subscribe so stories like this don't disappear. And if you'd like to, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We will love to know. The Rothmere estate sat like a crown jewel along the shoreline of Lake Forest, its limestone facade gleaming under the Illinois sun. Inside, however, the air carried a different weight, one that pressed against the lungs and made even laughter feel like an intrusion. Hannah Rothmere was known throughout the household as the quiet one. At 4 years old, she moved through the sprawling corridors like a ghost, her footsteps barely audible on the marble floors. The parade of specialists who visited had labeled it selective mutism, a diagnosis that Alistair Rothmere accepted with the cold efficiency of a man solving a business problem. "It's medical," he would say, dismissing any suggestion otherwise. "Children grow out of these things." But Janet Williams, the nanny who had cared for Hannah since infancy, knew better. She noticed things others missed. The way Hannah's small body would stiffen whenever they passed the kitchen, how her blue eyes would darken and track every movement when certain people entered a room. The child wasn't silent. She was vigilant. Some children don't lose their voice. They learn when it's dangerous to use it. Over the weeks, Janet began finding bruises on her own leg, deep purple marks that bloomed like dark flowers beneath her skin. She explained them away as clumsiness, the hazards of navigating a house with too many corners. But the bruises kept appearing, always in places that could be hidden, always after days when she'd asked too many questions. Hannah watched it all. Her dolls sat arranged in perfect rows on her bedroom shelf, their painted faces forever smiling. She would position herself in corners and doorways, her silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound. She saw the bruises on Janet's legs. She saw the way Janet's hands would tremble when she tied Hannah's shoes. She saw everything, and she said nothing. The doctors came and went with their clipboards and their theories. Alistair wrote checks and scheduled appointments. The household staff whispered about the poor mute child with the distant father. But no one asked why Hannah's silence felt less like absence and more like protection. No one wondered what she was protecting herself from. Most people would dismiss what Janet feels next as coincidence. Those people never find out what silence costs a child. Janet began documenting Hannah's behavior in a small notebook she kept tucked inside her apron pocket, not because anyone asked her to, but because patterns were emerging that defied the doctor's neat explanations. Hannah didn't flinch at voices. She flinched at footsteps. Certain rhythms would send the child scrambling. The sharp click of heels on tile, the heavy deliberate stride that announced arrival before a door ever opened. Janet watched as Hannah would press herself into the narrow space behind the kitchen cabinets during meal preparation, her small body folding into shadows as if she could disappear entirely. "Come out, sweetheart," Janet would whisper, but Hannah's eyes would remain fixed on the doorway, tracking something Janet couldn't see. It wasn't people Hannah monitored. It was movement patterns, the way someone entered a room, the speed at which they crossed the floor, the pause before they spoke. Hannah had become a student of approach, reading danger in the cadence of footsteps the way others read words on a page. Alistair Rothmere remained a phantom presence in his own home. Business trips stretched into weeks. When he returned, it was only to sleep and leave again before dawn. His study door stayed locked. His briefcase never left his side. He asked about Hannah's progress in the same tone he might inquire about quarterly earnings, detached, clinical, already moving to the next concern. The household ran on schedules dictated by Sloane Kerrigan, the estate manager whose influence seemed to extend into every corner of the residence. Staff rotations changed weekly. Access to certain rooms required approval. Janet found herself receiving new assignments that kept her away from Hannah during specific hours, always explained as efficiency improvements, always leaving her with a gnawing unease she couldn't articulate. What Janet thought was fear wasn't fear yet. Hannah continued her silent surveillance from corners and doorways. She had positioned herself to see everything while being seen by no one. Her dolls remained in their perfect rows, witnesses to secrets that existed in the space between what was happening and what could be proven. Janet wrote in her notebook, "Hannah doesn't react to who, she reacts to how." The distinction felt important, though she couldn't explain why. She thought she was beginning to understand the architecture of Hannah's silence, the logic behind her retreats. Janet thinks she understands the problem. She doesn't, and that misunderstanding will almost cost Hannah everything. Janet knelt beside Hannah's bed one evening, the notebook weighing heavy in her pocket. The house had settled into its usual evening quiet, the kind of silence that felt more like held breath and peace. "Sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a strand of dark hair from Hannah's face, "is someone being mean to you?" The question hung in the air between them. Hannah's blue eyes locked onto Janet's, wide and unblinking, but her lips remained pressed together. No nod, no shake of the head, just that penetrating stare that seemed to carry the weight of understanding far beyond her years. Janet tried again, softer. "You can tell me. I promise I'll." But Hannah had already turned away, curling into herself like a question mark against the pillow. 2 days later, Janet found her leg pulled into an unusual position. She'd been sorting laundry when Hannah appeared silently beside her and gently, deliberately, pushed Janet's bruised calf behind the laundry basket, hiding it from view. The gesture was so intentional, so loaded with meaning, that Janet's breath caught. The bruises weren't accidents. They were connected to proximity, to being too close, to seeing too much. Janet began paying attention to the staff roster with new urgency. Maria, the housekeeper who'd mentioned strange schedules 3 months ago, transferred to the Chicago residence. Thomas, the groundskeeper who'd asked why certain deliveries came at odd hours, let go for performance issues. Even Mrs. Chun, who'd worked for the Rothmers for a decade, had vanished after questioning why Hannah's therapy sessions kept being rescheduled. The pattern was undeniable. Questions led to absences. Janet lay awake that night, her mind churning through impossible mathematics. If she reported her suspicions, she would be removed. Hannah would be left alone, unmonitored, with no one watching the patterns. But if she stayed silent, if she kept her head down and her observations to herself, she could remain close. She could be the buffer between Hannah and whatever shadow moved through this house. Not every wrong act announces itself. Some wait for permission. The moral calculus seemed clear. Staying meant protection, even if temporary. Leaving meant abandonment. Janet convinced herself that witnessing was a form of guardianship, that her presence alone provided safety. She chose to stay quiet. She documented everything in her notebook, but told no one. She accepted the schedule changes Sloane Kerrigan issued without protest. She smiled and nodded and became invisible in the way that kept people employed in the Rothmer household. Janet chooses what feels like the safer option. It's the wrong one, but she won't know that yet. The kitchen floor was cold against Janet's skin. She'd rolled up her pant leg to examine the latest bruise. This one darker than the others, spreading across her calf like spilled ink. The fluorescent lights overhead made it look even more severe, purple bleeding into black at the edges. She didn't hear Hannah approach. The child moved like smoke, suddenly present where there had been emptiness. Hannah knelt beside her, small fingers hovering above the bruise, without quite touching it, as if the injury might burn. Janet's breath caught. "It's okay, sweetheart. The sound of the side door opening cut her off. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, exhausted. Alistair Rothmere entered mid-stride, briefcase swinging at his side, his mind clearly elsewhere. He was 3 steps into the kitchen before he registered the scene before him. He froze. Time crystallized. Janet scrambled to pull down her pant leg, her movements frantic and guilty. Her hands shook as she tried to cover the evidence, to restore the careful facade that kept this household functioning. Hannah remained kneeling. She turned slowly, her blue eyes lifting to meet her father's gaze. The silence in the room felt physical, pressing against walls and windows. Then Hannah spoke. "Who hurt you, Mom?" The words detonated through the kitchen like a shockwave. 3 words. Her first words. Each one carrying the weight of 4 years of silence, for years of watching, for years of understanding what the adults around her refused to see. Janet's composure shattered. A sob escaped her throat, raw, involuntary, terrified. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears began streaming down her face. She shook her head violently, unable to form words, unable to reclaim the moment now exploding around them. Alistair's briefcase hit the floor with a crack that echoed through the kitchen. His face had gone completely white, his eyes fixed on his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. The child who hadn't spoken in 4 years. The child he'd reduced to a medical file and specialist appointments. Hannah didn't repeat herself. She simply watched him, her small hand still hovering protectively over Janet's bruised leg, her expression carrying a gravity that no 4-year-old should possess. When a child finally speaks, it's never without reason. Alistair's mind raced, connecting dots he'd refused to see. The silence, the tension, Janet's injuries, his daughter's fear. He thought he finally understood. Someone in his household had been hurting Janet, and Hannah had witnessed it all. Alistair believes he finally understands the problem. He is wrong, and what he does next makes everything worse. Janet's voice cracked as she tried to rebuild the walls that Hannah's 3 words had demolished. "Mr. Rothmere, please. It's not what it looks like. I've been clumsy, the stairs, the furniture." "Stop." Alistair's command cut through her stammering. He stood rigid in the center of the kitchen, his CEO composure fracturing at the edges. "How long has this been happening?" "It's nothing, truly. I bruise easily, always have," the doctor said. "What doctor?" His eyes narrowed. "When did you see a doctor?" Janet faltered. There had been no doctor. The lie dissolved on her tongue, leaving only silence. Alistair pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with the decisive efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems through action. "I'm calling our attorney. Someone in this house has been." "No." Janet's desperation filled the room. "Please, Mr. Rothmere, it's not necessary. I just need to be more careful, to pay better attention." But Alistair wasn't listening. His focus had shifted entirely to Janet's injuries, to the visible evidence of harm, to the clear narrative of staff abuse that seemed to explain everything. Hannah's 4 years of silence, her strategic positioning, her fear, all of it recategorized as trauma from witnessing Janet's mistreatment. The study door opened. Sloane Kerrigan entered with the timing of someone who'd been listening from just outside. Her expression carried perfect concern, her voice modulated to convey both empathy and efficiency. "Mr. Rothmere, might I suggest a solution?" She moved closer, her presence filling the space. "Janet clearly needs time to recover. We could arrange a paid leave, 6 months, perhaps, at one of the wellness centers we use for executive staff. Full medical care, therapy, complete rest." Alistair nodded slowly. "Yes, that makes sense." "No." Janet's whisper was barely audible. Please, I can't leave Hannah. It's for the best, Sloan continued smoothly. Hannah needs stability, and you need healing. We'll bring in a temporary replacement, someone thoroughly vetted. You can return when you're well. Janet looked at Hannah, still kneeling on the floor. The child's face had gone pale, her blue eyes wide with an emotion that looked like terror but moved deeper, recognition of a pattern repeating, of protection being stripped away. You'll pack tonight, Alistair said, his tone final. Sloan will arrange the transport for tomorrow morning. The truth wasn't hidden anymore, but it still wasn't visible. Hannah's scream split the air, raw, primal, the sound of silence finally breaking. She launched herself at Janet, small arms wrapping around the nanny's leg with desperate strength. The child, who hadn't made a sound in 4 years, now wailed like something vital was being torn from her chest. Removing Janet solves one problem. It exposes a worse one. Hannah's scream faded into hiccuping sobs, but she didn't release her grip on Janet. Alistair stood frozen, watching his daughter display more emotion in 30 seconds than she had in 4 years. Something in the raw desperation of her reaction pierced through his executive detachment. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to Hannah's eye level. Hannah, sweetheart, Janet will be safe. She's just going somewhere she can. No. Hannah's voice emerged small but clear, cutting through his reassurance. Her second complete sentence. The house moves wrong when she's not here. The words hung in the air, cryptic and chilling. Alistair exchanged a glance with Sloan, whose expression had shifted to something harder to read. What do you mean, the house moves wrong? Alistair asked gently. Hannah's fingers tightened on Janet's sleeve. When Mum leaves, when Mrs. Chen left, when Thomas left, the footsteps come at the wrong time. The doors open when they shouldn't. Janet's breath caught. She thought Hannah was tracking people, but the child had been mapping something more complex, patterns of access, windows of vulnerability, moments when protection dissolved. Alistair's mind, trained to identify systematic failures in corporate structures, began applying the same analysis to his household. Sloan, pull the security logs for the past 6 months. I want to see every entry, every movement, Sir, I'm not sure that's, Sloan began. Now, 20 minutes later, Alistair sat in his study, Janet and Hannah nearby, scrolling through digital records that painted a picture he'd been too absent to see. Gaps appeared in coverage, 30-minute windows where cameras went offline for maintenance. Staff schedules that created unsupervised access to Hannah's wing. Delivery logs showing arrivals that no one had ordered. Every gap, every anomaly, had been internally approved, authorized by estate management, signed off by someone with administrative access. These windows, Alistair said slowly, his finger hovering over the screen. They coincide with my travel schedule. Every time I left for more than 3 days. Janet leaned forward, her voice barely audible. The bruises started appearing during those windows. Sometimes the danger isn't the hand that strikes, but the door that stays open. Alistair looked at his daughter, who had stopped crying but remained pressed against Janet. Hannah hadn't been afraid of a person. She'd been afraid of vulnerability, of the moments when the architecture of protection crumbled and something predatory could move freely through the house. The harm wasn't coming from one abusive staff member. It was coming from orchestrated access, from someone creating opportunities for something to happen when no one was watching closely enough to stop it. Who approved these maintenance windows? Alistair asked, though dread was already forming an answer in his mind. Sloan stood near the doorway, her posture perfect, her face carefully neutral. I have to check the administrative records, sir. Alistair now knows enough to act, but not enough to choose correctly. The reinstatement happened without ceremony. Janet received a brief phone call from Alistair's assistant. The wellness center arrangements had been canceled. Her position was secure. No further explanation provided. She returned to the Rothmere estate the following morning to find her room exactly as she'd left it, as if the previous day's chaos had been carefully erased from the official record. Hannah was waiting in the hallway when Janet arrived. The child didn't run to her, didn't speak, but her small hand found Janet's and held tight. That grip said everything words couldn't. Sloane Kerrigan remained. She continued managing the estate with the same efficient precision, her schedules and authorizations flowing through the household like they always had. Alistair hadn't confronted her, hadn't accused her, hadn't even adjusted her access to the administrative systems. Janet watched him watching Sloane, saw the careful calculation in his eyes. He was gathering evidence, she realized, building a case the way he would against a corporate adversary, methodically, legally, with documentation that could withstand scrutiny. But that approach took time, and every day that Sloane remained felt like sleeping in a house with unlocked doors. Hannah began speaking in fragments, never full sentences, never unprompted, but words emerged like careful test balloons released into uncertain air. "Dark soon," she'd whisper when evening approached. "Mum stays," she'd announce, as if reminding herself of a new rule that might evaporate. "Footsteps quiet," she'd observe, cataloging safety in the absence of threat. The therapist Alistair brought and called it progress. Selective mutism breaking down, trust rebuilding, voice returning in manageable increments. They celebrated each word as if Hannah were learning to speak for the first time, rather than reclaiming something that had been strategically suppressed. But Alistair understood the darker truth. Public exposure would mean investigations, media attention, testimonies that would place Hannah at the center of questions she was too young to navigate. The legal process would demand she explain what she'd seen, what she'd endured, what she'd witnessed happen to Janet. It would transform her recovery into performance, her trauma into evidence. He could protect his daughter or pursue justice. The two paths seemed to diverge the more he examined them. What healed Hannah was not justice. The house settled into a new rhythm that felt like safety but moved like surveillance. Janet stayed close. Alistair remained present. Hannah's words accumulated slowly, building toward something that might eventually resemble normalcy. But in the quiet moments, Janet would catch Sloane's gaze across a room and see something that looked like patience. Not defeat, not fear, just patience, the kind that comes from knowing how to wait, how to watch, how to recognize when scrutiny eventually relaxes. What waited next would demand it. The announcement came through internal channels with corporate efficiency. Sloane Kerrigan had accepted a position with another family. A lateral move, generous severance, glowing references. No investigation mentioned. No accusations made public. She departed on a Tuesday morning, her belongings already packed, her transition so seamless it barely registered as disruption. Janet watched the car pull away from an upstairs window, Hannah standing silently beside her. The child's hand found Janet's, squeezed once, then released. That was all. No celebration, no relief. Just acknowledgement that a certain kind of danger had relocated rather than disappeared. The new estate manager was older, methodical, someone Alistair had personally vetted through channels that went beyond resume and references. Security protocols changed. Camera maintenance happened during daylight with full staff awareness. Schedule changes required written justification and secondary approval. Janet remained in her position, not promoted, not publicly recognized, but something more valuable had shifted. When she spoke now, Alistair listened. When she raised concerns, they were investigated rather than dismissed. Her observations had weight because they'd proven true when it mattered most. Hannah's vocabulary expanded in careful increments. She spoke about her dolls, about the lake visible from her bedroom window, about whether it might rain. She asked questions about dinner and bedtime stories, and whether Janet would be there in the morning. She never spoke about the months of silence, never explained what she'd witnessed in the gaps between adult awareness. The therapist said pushing for those memories would be counterproductive. Some things healed better when left unexamined, when a child was allowed to move forward without constantly excavating the past. Every evening now, Alistair sat in the kitchen. No phone, no briefcase, no excuses about urgent calls or pending deals. He would sit at the counter while Janet prepared dinner, while Hannah colored at the table, present in a way that felt like relearning how to occupy space without escape routes. "Tell me about your day," he'd say to Hannah, and she would offer fragments, enough to build connection without demanding vulnerability. One night, as Janet wiped down counters and Hannah arranged her crayons, Alistair spoke quietly. "I should have seen it sooner." Janet paused, but didn't turn around. "You see it now. Some miracles aren't loud. They're the quiet decision to never look away again." Hannah looked up from her drawing. A house with oversized windows and a door painted bright red. She'd been drawing houses for weeks now, each one with more windows than the last, as if redesigning the architecture of safety from the ground up. "Daddy stays now," she observed, not quite a question. "Yes," Alistair replied. "Daddy stays." The words settled into the kitchen like a promise made in the presence of witnesses. Not dramatic, not particularly eloquent, but weighted with the kind of commitment that required daily renewal, the decision to remain present, to keep watching, to never again mistake absence for trust. Janet folded the dish towel and hung it carefully. She thought about all the children in houses across the world who learned to be quiet, who mapped danger in footsteps, who waited for adults to notice what had been visible all along. Some people stop listening once the danger passes. The ones who stay, they're the reason children like Hannah survive.